No one in Flaxborough could say with any conviction that the annual summer horticultural and handicrafts exhibition ever yielded excitement. It was, as Councillor Glossop liked to put it, a reassuringly unremarkable occasion. There were dahlias, jams, knitted infants' cardigans, and this year a floral arrangement titled Peace After Laundry, which had taken the Women's Guild first prize largely on the grounds that no one wished to offend its arranger, Mrs. Vera Cleeve, who happened to be married to the church warden. By mid-afternoon, the exhibition tent smelled of chrysanthemums and elderly conversation. The judges, their duty done, were leaning toward the refreshment stand with the air of men who had recently survived diplomacy. A brass band played something vaguely triumphal near the duck pond. It was at this point, as the mayor was congratulating himself on the turnout, that Miss Enid Trousby saw the mask. At first she assumed it part of the artistic miscellany table, a curious assortment of pottery owls and macrame curios. But then, when she looked again, the mask was gone, or, more accurately, moving. It was white, expressionless, except for the faint, painted curve of a smile. Beneath the paper surface, 2 eye-holes glinted. It vanished behind the trellis of climbing roses that framed the tent's rear flap. Miss Trousby, not a woman easily accused of hysteria, stood quite still. Then she said, in a voice both prim and uncertain, "That was not in the catalogue." The mayor, catching only the tone, turned. Oh yes, splendid arrangement, isn't it?" Miss Trousby frowned at him, found no ally there, and departed in search of one. By the time Inspector Purbright heard of the matter, which is to say, nearly 2 hours later, the story had improved with travel. According to Mr. Willison, the postmaster, it was a burglar in fancy dress. To Mrs. Farden, who ran the tea stall, it was something to do with that widow up on the hill. It's the one with the peculiar house. To Sergeant Malley, who relayed the tale with visible restraint, it was a person of uncertain description wearing a sort of theatrical contrivance and scaring respectable ladies at the flower show. Purbright, seated behind his desk at the station, stirred his tea thoughtfully. Did this respectable lady indicate whether the person in question was engaged in any particular mischief? "Not that she could prove, sir," said Malley. "She said it. The mask, I mean, was smiling at her." "Smiling," repeated Purbright mildly, "is not in itself a criminal act." "No, sir." Though Miss Trousby said it was a knowing smile, Purbright looked up.
"Ah, well, that's more serious." He took a slow sip,
eyes wandering to the window where the evening sun threw long, patient beams across the police yard. That night, Miss Trousby's story appeared, albeit with editorial discretion, in the Flaxborough Citizen. The headline, "Unidentified Person at Exhibition," was accompanied by a statement from the mayor assuring readers there was no cause for alarm. By the next morning, there was inevitably cause for alarm. The caretaker at St. Luke's Hall, where the exhibition trophies had been stored overnight, found the place unlocked. Nothing seemed missing at first, but among the ribbons and labels on the central table lay something that ought not to have been there. A mask, white, smooth, with the faintest trace of a smile. When Purbright arrived, summoned more from social expectation than urgency, he stood for several seconds looking at it. "It's papier-mâché," said the caretaker, eager to be helpful. "Light as air."
"Not one of ours, though."
"Looks like something from a school play." Purbright crouched, examining the painted surface. "Indeed, you say it wasn't here when you locked up?" "No, sir."
"Only the cups and the vases. Must have been brought in after hours." Purbright's expression did not alter, but a slight furrow appeared above his brow.
"You're quite certain the door was locked?" "Double-checked it myself." "Then someone must have had a key," murmured Purbright. The caretaker looked indignant.
"I'm the only one with one."
Purbright gave a small, non-committal nod. "I rather thought you might be." He straightened, gazing once more at the mask. Smiling, isn't it? The caretaker gave a nervous laugh. Suppose it is, sir. Purbright considered the object as one might a guest who had arrived without invitation. You know, Mr. Dinnis, he said at last, in my experience, when something turns up where it shouldn't, it's either a mistake
Or a message. And which do you think this is, Inspector?
Purbright's gaze drifted toward the tall windows, where the sunlight caught the motes of dust like faint glitter. Oh, he said gently, I should imagine we'll find that out soon enough. Outside, the market square resumed its untroubled hum. Bicycles leaned against the bakery wall. The newsagent's bell tinkled. Somewhere, Miss Trousby was repeating for perhaps the 7th time that morning, that she knew the mask had smiled, and that she didn't much care for the way it had looked at her, as if it recognized something. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, stood at the door of St. Luke's Hall, eyes following a paper scrap fluttering down the cobbles. When it landed, he bent and picked it up. It was a torn corner of brown wrapping paper, faintly marked with the words, "To be delivered after midnight." By the following morning, Flaxborough had converted the incident of the smiling mask into a matter of polite obsession. The Citizen's cautious paragraph was expanded by word of mouth into a drama involving secret admirers, escaped mental patients, and by lunchtime, a continental art smuggler who had mistaken St. Luke's Hall for a rendezvous point. At the Rose and Crown, the town's moral nerve centre, 4 women of the Women's Guild discussed the business over scones. Miss Trousby, whose account had launched the whole affair, sat in dignified silence while the others improved upon her experience. I shouldn't be at all surprised, declared Mrs. Farden.
If it were young Colin Blore, he's in amateur dramatics, you know.
Spends half his life painting his face white. Too short, said Miss Trousby sharply. This person was tall, gracefully tall, not lanky. Mrs. Cleeve stirred her tea with tragic deliberation. It may not have been a person at all. I've always said that place was drafty. Drafts can move things. Miss Trousby looked at her as one might at a cat that had spoken. Drafts, Mrs. Cleeve, do not smile. At another table, Councillor Glossop, who enjoyed any conversation in which he might sound informed, leaned toward a reporter from the Citizen. Perfectly harmless prank, my boy. But of course, these little incidents can unsettle the elderly and, more imaginative members of the community. He paused, then added with satisfaction, Still, it's something to print between council meetings. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was not so easily settled. He had spent the morning listening to the caretaker, to Miss Trousby again, and to the mayor, who chiefly wished to be reassured that public confidence would not be disturbed. Purbright assured him that it would not, though he privately suspected the town enjoyed its disturbances too much to relinquish them quickly. Back at the station, he stood before his office window, looking out upon the yard where Sergeant Malley was teaching a new constable the art of filling out a parking summons legibly. The paper scrap lay on his desk, now sealed in a paper evidence envelope that seemed rather grand for so minor a clue. After midnight, he murmured to himself. The words lingered like the tale of a thought half-formed. Malley entered, his cap slightly askew. Just had a word from the post office, sir. They've checked their deliveries. Nothing out of place. No packages addressed to anyone new, Purbright nodded. And St. Luke's Hall? Door secure now? Yes, sir.
New lock fitted. Mr. Dinnis insists he'll sleep there tonight if necessary. Purbright smiled faintly.
I should advise against that.
Vigilance has a way of becoming theatrical after dark. Malley looked uncertain whether this was advice or philosophy, so he simply nodded and withdrew. Purbright turned again to the window.
The town below ticked along in its quiet rhythm. Market carts, gossiping clerks, the distant drone of the milk van. Nothing here suggested masks or messages. Yet he had learned over years of service that Flaxborough's apparent calm was never far from comic mischief or something less comic.
Pretending to be, he opened his drawer and removed
a folder marked Miscellaneous Disturbances. Inside, were notes from other such trifles, anonymous letters, misplaced objects, curious nocturnal noises. Most were pranks, some romantic misadventures. One or two, in time, had not been so harmless. As he placed the new note inside, he caught himself glancing at the clock. The hands rested just before noon, and sunlight flickered on the brass frame. "After midnight," he said again softly, as though testing the sound for any hint of meaning. Then, taking up his hat, he decided on a walk, ostensibly to check the post office records, but in truth to observe the town itself, how it whispered, exaggerated, and embroidered its fears into entertainment. For in Flaxborough,
a rumour was like yeast. It grew best when left in the warm. And by the time evening fell,
the mask that had smiled after midnight was already smiling anew, this time from every tongue that cared to tell its tale. Inspector Purbright began his morning with a deliberate unhurriedness that suggested, to the casual observer, a man content with routine. In truth, he was waiting to see who among the town's talkers would volunteer themselves by enthusiasm alone. It was a tactic that rarely failed. In Flaxborough, curiosity was as self-incriminating as fingerprints. By 9 o'clock, Miss Enid Trousby was already in the station's waiting area, sitting bolt upright with a handbag that appeared ready to repel attack. Purbright received her with the kind of politeness that gently disarms the righteous. "I understand, Miss Trousby," he began, "that you were the first to notice this."
"Presents at the exhibition?"
Miss Trousby's lips tightened, producing a smile that could have sterilized cutlery.
"I did not notice, Inspector. I witnessed."
"There is a distinction." "Indeed," said Purbright gravely. "Would you describe what you witnessed as precisely as you can?" Her account, when given, was impressive in vocabulary, if not in chronology. The mask had moved, perhaps glided. Its eyes, if indeed they were eyes, had been attentive but mocking. She insisted the figure had paused deliberately when it saw her, a gesture she interpreted as recognition. "Recognition of you personally?" asked Purbright gently. "Of course," she said, as though surprised at the question. "I have lived in Flaxborough all my life. One becomes known." When she had gone, leaving behind a faint odour of lavender and disapproval, Purbright sat back and folded his hands. Miss Trousby's testimony, though colourful, was unlikely to be useful in its original form. Yet one remark had stuck, the sense that the mask had recognised her. There was ego in it, certainly, but also the instinct of someone who had truly felt observed. His next conversation, that afternoon, was with Mr. Colin Blore, a lanky youth who ran the lighting for the local amateur dramatic society. Blore, though affable, wore the guiltless smile of a man accustomed to being suspected of mischief on principle. "I've got a few masks, yes, sir," he admitted cheerfully, "but not like that one. Ours are for the importance of being earnest, and that's hardly midnight material, is it?"
"Unless performed badly," Purbright murmured. Blore grinned.
"Well, we've had reviews that said as much." He shook his head.
"But no, Inspector. We haven't used anything like that."
Looked more like something from one of those commedia dell'arte pieces. Italian, bit eerie. Would you know where such a mask might be bought locally? Could try Henton's Antiques.
Old theatrical gear sometimes turns up there.
Though old Henton's eyesight's gone a bit foggy, he once sold me a teapot lid as a Greek relic. Purbright made a note, thanked him and moved on. At Henton's shop, a cave of dust and incongruous treasures, the proprietor looked at him through spectacles like saucers.
"A mask, Inspector? Oh, I've had plenty in my time."
"Carnival things, ceremonial, even a few from funerary sets." But none of them smiled. Most things that come in here don't these days. Purbright's gaze roamed over the shelves. Nothing white, nothing smiling. But behind the counter stood a ledger, its recent pages bearing a few faint pencil entries. "Mind if I look?" he asked. Henton, too deaf to hear the question, nodded anyway. Purbright ran a finger down the page. 2 days before the exhibition, paper mask, sold, no name, only a receipt number. He thanked the old man and took down the details. Outside, the late afternoon had begun to thin into evening, the town mellowing under amber light. Purbright walked back to the station at a measured pace, turning over the fragments of his day, a frightened woman who felt recognized, a cheerful youth who laughed too easily, and a mask bought quietly, without a name. He placed the ledger note beside the torn paper scrap and studied them both. "After midnight," he murmured again. Then, as if addressing the mask itself, he added softly, "Who were you smiling for?" Inspector Purbright had long believed that the most useful witnesses were seldom the most forthcoming. The exception to this, of course, was Mrs. Lavinia Frowes, a widow of 3 years, owner of the handsome ivy-clad house on Hill Crescent, and a woman for whom silence was not so much golden as impossible. She had telephoned the station shortly after breakfast, in a voice trembling with what she described as moral unease. Purbright, intrigued by both words, arranged to call upon her that afternoon. The Frowes residence possessed the kind of tidy charm that declared itself to all passers-by: polished brass, an immaculately trimmed hedge, and curtains that somehow managed to look vigilant. Mrs. Frowes met him in the drawing-room, where the clock ticked with an air of judgment. "Oh,
Inspector," she began, pressing a hand to her collarbone.
"You must think me quite absurd, but I felt it my duty to speak."
"I believe I may have seen your masked individual." Purbright inclined his head.
"Where, Mrs. Frowes?" "In my garden."
"Last night."
"Around 12:30, he did not immediately reply. Outside, the faint hum of a lawnmower floated through the afternoon.
"And you're quite certain it was not a trick of shadow or light?"
Her eyes widened, offended by the suggestion.
"Inspector, I've been a widow for 3 years."
"I know the difference between loneliness and trespass." Purbright, suppressing a smile, gestured for her to continue. "I had gone downstairs for a glass of water. The air was terribly close. I looked through the conservatory door, and there it was, standing by the rose beds, perfectly still. The moonlight caught it, and I saw that same dreadful smile. Did it move? It inclined its head slightly,
"As though acknowledging me."
Then, oh, it sounds ridiculous, it seemed to turn away and vanish among the trees." Purbright regarded her with polite attention. "Did you notice anything else? Sound, scent, movement?" She hesitated. "Only that my garden gate was open this morning." "It never is." He made a brief note, then asked, "You've lived here long, Mrs. Frowes?" "All my married life. My husband, the late Mr. Frowes, was a builder."
"Very respected." Her tone suggested sainthood.
"Since his passing, I've tried to maintain standards." "I see. And you've had no disturbances before?" "Never. Though I have wondered about the new tenants at the end of the lane. Peculiar hours, very odd furniture."
"Foreign, I think." Purbright nodded mildly, neither encouraging nor dismissing the remark.
"Would you permit Sergeant Malley to examine the garden this evening?" "By all means," she said, clasping her hands. "If this intruder is still about, I should rather he be found before he frightens anyone else. Miss Trousby, for example, isn't strong-minded." When he rose to leave, she followed him to the door, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. "You know, Inspector, I can't help but feel this has something to do with that note you found. The one about after midnight. Such an ominous phrase, don't you think?" Purbright gave her a courteous smile.
"Sometimes, Mrs. Frowes, the most ominous phrases mean no more than they say." He stepped into the sunlight.
Leaving her framed in the doorway like a figure in one of her own lace curtains, composed, faintly tragic, and very sure of her importance in whatever drama she imagined herself part of. As he walked back toward the station, Purbright considered her account. A sighting after midnight, a garden gate left open, and that same curious description of a silent acknowledgement. Too deliberate for a mere prank, too restrained for real menace. Yet something about the widow's story unsettled him, not because it confirmed a fear, but because it fit too neatly. When he reached the end of Hill Crescent, he turned for one last glance at the Frowes house. The lace curtain in the drawing-room fluttered slightly, though the air was still. For an instant he thought he saw a pale reflection in the glass, the faint outline of something oval, smooth and white. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, and Inspector Purbright, not given to melodrama, merely adjusted his hat and continued down the quiet lane toward the waiting dusk. By the next morning, the story of Mrs. Frows's nocturnal visitor had become another polished pebble rolling along the current of Flaxborough conversation. What had begun as a fleeting curiosity was now a communal anxiety refined by retelling. The phrase "after midnight" had entered local vocabulary with the vigor of a hymn refrain. Even the postman, usually immune to small-town theatre, was overheard suggesting that someone's having a bit of fun with that mask business, though it's not the sort of fun you'd call British. Inspector Purbright, who preferred to let speculation travel ahead of him like weather, arrived at the station carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. It had been handed in by the librarian, who claimed it had been found that morning on the steps of the reading room. There was no address, no stamp, only a penciled phrase, faint but legible. "Please return this to its rightful face." He unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a folded sheet of newspaper and, within that, a fragment of papier-mâché, thin, brittle, and painted a dull white. The curve of the piece suggested it had once been part of a cheek, perhaps the left side. Along its inner surface, faint traces of glue and something darker. Maybe soot, maybe the residue of handling. Purbright examined it for a long moment before placing it beside the earlier evidence, the torn note from St. Luke's Hall. Both items shared the same texture of mystery, ordinary materials arranged to imply design. He wrote a brief instruction for Sergeant Malley to check the library's door logs, then took his hat and set out once more for Hill Crescent. Mrs. Frowse received him with the theatrical relief of one expecting reassurance, but secretly hoping for alarm. "Oh, Inspector, I was just saying to Mrs. Larch that I couldn't close an eye last night."
Every sound made me think it was, well, it. I quite understand, Purbright said.
"You mentioned before that your late husband had been a builder. Would he by any chance have kept materials for papier-mâché or plasterwork?" She blinked, startled. "Good heavens, no. He built houses, not pantomimes." Purbright smiled faintly. "Quite so, though you'll agree the line between the two is occasionally narrow." She followed his gaze to a small writing bureau, its drawers precisely aligned. "You think someone made that mask, Inspector?" "I think someone made it, yes. But perhaps not recently." That notion seemed to please her. "Something from the past returning," she murmured, with the air of a woman whose life, if lacking adventure, might at least contain echoes of Gothic fiction. Purbright made a few more polite inquiries and departed, taking the long way back through the churchyard. There he found Reverend Chubb tending to the flower beds near the vestry door. The vicar greeted him with the good cheer of a man who regards gossip as a form of fellowship. "Dreadful goings-on, Inspector. I dare say our visitor might be one of those souls drawn to nocturnal mischief. Theatricality, after all, is but another path to sin." Purbright's reply was gentle. "Have you had anything missing from the church, Reverend? Costumes, props, or perhaps something used in a pageant?" "Nothing that I know of, unless you count Mrs. Peebles' son borrowing the angel wings again for some university nonsense." The inspector inclined his head, thanked him, and continued toward the square. His pace was unhurried, but his thoughts moved with quiet precision. A handmade mask, a deliberate message, a pattern of appearances that seemed intended more to unsettle than to conceal. It was not the work of someone hiding, it was the work of someone performing. Back at the station, Malley awaited him with the librarian's statement. The parcel, it seemed, had appeared on the steps some time between closing and dawn. No one had been seen delivering it. "Could have been left by a passer-by," Mally suggested. "Possibly," Purbright said, lowering himself into his chair. "But if you were to deliver a message meant for secrecy, would you choose the steps of the public library?" Mally frowned. "I suppose not." "No," said Purbright. "You'd choose it because you wanted it found. You'd want someone to read it and worry." He tapped the fragment lightly with his pen. "This mask was meant to smile, but it's no longer smiling, is it, Sergeant? It's crumbling." Mally hesitated. "So you think the person who made it's losing control?" Purbright gave a small, almost kind smile.
On the contrary, Sergeant, I think they're just beginning. Inspector Purbright had learned long ago that in Flaxborough, the surest way to gather intelligence was not through interrogation, but through luncheon. The Flaxborough Gentlemen's
Club, an establishment whose members were neither particularly gentle nor notably clubbable, provided a near-perfect stage for the inspector's quiet inquiries. The club occupied a fading Georgian house overlooking the square, its windows always half-curtained as though to spare the outside world from the burden of its opinions. Inside, the atmosphere smelled faintly of port, tobacco, and the consoling conviction that the town's better days had occurred before electricity. Purbright entered shortly after 2, removing his hat and nodding politely to the steward, who greeted him with a discreet mixture of respect and apprehension, emotions common to those aware that policemen, like priests, might arrive under any pretext. At a table near the hearth sat Councillor Glossop, the town's self-appointed authority on everything unverified. He was holding forth to 2 listeners who alternated between indulgent laughter and visible fatigue. The inspector, seeing no reasons to disturb such fruitful vanity, merely ordered tea and took a nearby seat. Glossop was in mid-flow. "It's my firm belief, gentlemen, that we are dealing with something symbolic. You'll notice the timing: after midnight, moonlight, masks. All the ingredients of a statement. Perhaps a protest against civic hypocrisy." "Whose hypocrisy?" murmured one of his companions. "Everyone's," Glossop replied confidently. "That's the modern way." Purbright, stirring his tea, looked over mildly. "A protester who leaves papier-mâché instead of pamphlets."
It does have a certain novelty. Glossop turned, pleased to have drawn official interest. "Ah, Inspector, you'll find, I think, that these incidents reflect the artistic temperament. I've always said that when people can't find expression in the theatre, they turn to spectacle."
"Then perhaps we should subsidize another pantomime," Purbright suggested. "It might save the police some paperwork." Glossop laughed, assuming agreement, though the inspector's tone was closer to reflection. He continued with fresh enthusiasm. "Of course, there's the question of who. I'd not rule out the widow myself. Fine woman, but fond of attention." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "You believe Mrs. Frowes staged her own haunting?" "Well," Glossop said, lowering his voice, "she's been quite the recluse since her husband died. Some say he left matters unfinished." The inspector let the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle. "Financially unfinished?" Glossop coloured slightly. No, purely sentimental, I assure you. But the mind does strange things in loneliness." "Indeed it does," said Purbright quietly. He thanked the steward, paid for his tea, and took his leave, leaving Glossop to inflate further upon the thin air of speculation. Outside, the town was bathed in the mellow gold of late afternoon. Purbright walked slowly toward the market, his mind turning over the fragments of talk. A symbolic act, a performance, a lonely widow, and a fragment of mask appearing as though summoned by gossip itself. At the edge of the square, a small figure waved to him, Miss Trounsby, of course, breathless with the urgency of one who lives on narrative. "Inspector, you must know Mrs. Frowes has had callers. 2 strange men this very hour at her gate. One carried a parcel." Purbright inclined his head, expression unchanged. "Thank you, Miss Trounsby. I dare say you'll tell me tomorrow what was in it." He continued on his way, choosing not to quicken his pace. If there was indeed a delivery, it would wait. Truth in Flaxborough had a habit of staying put until politeness arrived. As he reached the corner near the tobacconist's, he paused to light a cigarette. The smoke rose in the warm air, curling upward like a thought refusing to take form. Somewhere behind him the club's windows reflected the afternoon sun, and for an instant, in that mirrored glass, he fancied he saw a faint white oval, a shape too smooth to be accidental, too still to be reflection. When he looked again, it was gone, leaving only his own calm face gazing back. Purbright exhaled softly and resumed his walk, thinking that in Flaxborough masks seldom needed paper. Most were worn quite comfortably without. The night had the peculiar stillness that precedes the fall of rain, air heavy, lamps dimmed, and sound suspended as though waiting for permission to continue. At precisely 12 minutes past midnight, Mrs. Lavinia Frowes awoke to the creak of her garden gate. She lay rigid beneath the counterpane, pulse beating like a small drum in her throat. For one trembling moment she considered remaining perfectly still and letting the intruder discover nothing but silence. But curiosity, that fatal strength of the Flaxborough spirit, overcame discretion. She rose, wrapped herself in her shawl, and moved through the house with cautious ceremony. At the conservatory door she halted. The moon hung low behind a gauze of cloud, lighting the garden with a ghostly pallor. The roses shone like dimmed lanterns. There by the sundial stood the mask again, its expression serene, almost tender, the painted mouth tilted in eternal amusement. Mrs. Frowes gasped and pressed a hand to her chest. The figure turned toward her, head inclining with the same slow, deliberate grace she remembered. And then, as if deciding something, it raised one gloved hand and pointed toward the house. Her composure broke. She stumbled backward, nearly upsetting the fern stand, and fled to the telephone in the hall. The operator's sleepy voice answered, her distress with bureaucratic calm. Within 7 minutes, Sergeant Malley was at her gate, his torch cutting through the gloom. By then the garden was empty. Only the scent of crushed petals lingered, and the gate swung idly on its hinge. Malley found no footprints, no damage. Only, near the base of the sundial, a small object half buried in the soil. He lifted it carefully. In his handkerchief, a button, smooth and dark, with the faint imprint of a crown at its centre. When Inspector Purbright arrived 10 minutes later, the widow was restored to armchair dignity, though her voice trembled with the remnants of outrage. "It looked at me, Inspector, looked, and then it gestured. You'll think me fanciful, but it was as if it wanted to be let in." Purbright regarded her gently. "And you did not recognize the figure's build, height, or movement?" "Not clearly," she admitted, "but there was something. The posture, perhaps. Confident, but familiar. It reminded me of my husband years ago before the rheumatism." Purbright made no comment. He studied the button in its wrapping, then stepped out into the garden, his torch beam sweeping over the damp grass. The night had begun to mist, and in the lamplight the air looked almost solid. He paused near the sundial. The soil was disturbed in a neat semicircle, as if someone had stood there carefully, not prowled, but posed. He turned back to Mally, who stood uneasily at the gate. "You'll take the button to the station, have it checked against local uniforms. Porter, messenger, constable, anyone who wears a crown. Think it's military, sir? Possibly, or theatrical. In either case, its owner meant to leave a trace." Inside, Mrs. Frowes watched from the conservatory door, pale against the dim interior light. Purbright rejoined her, removing his hat. "You'll keep your doors locked, Mrs. Frowes, and your curtains drawn. If our visitor intends another call, I'd rather he found you asleep than expectant." She nodded, half offended by the suggestion of passivity.
"Inspector," she said, lowering her voice, "do you believe it was warning me or taunting me?"
He looked at her with calm sincerity.
"I think, Mrs. Frowes, it was rehearsing," the widow blinked,
uncertain whether she had been comforted or insulted. Purbright left her house as the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly on his umbrella. The streets were deserted, every lamp haloed by drizzle. He walked back through the market square, where the shop signs gleamed faintly under their film of moisture. At the door of the police station he paused, glancing toward the dark windows of St. Luke's Hall across the road.
A single glimmer moved within, perhaps reflection, perhaps not. He unlocked the door quietly and entered.
On his desk, beside the evidence folder, lay a small white envelope that had not been there earlier. No handwriting marked it, only the faint impression of a smiling mouth pressed into the paper. Inside was another note, typed this time, neat and centered. Every mask must be worn twice. Purbright read it once, then again, before sliding it beneath the folder. He extinguished the lamp and stood for a while in the soft darkness, listening to the rain against the windows. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a murmur. "Then let's see whose face remains when it isn't." The rain lingered into morning, washing the town with a thin, colourless light. Inspector Purbright, who disliked days that looked half-finished, sat in his office with the window ajar and the sound of dripping gutters filling the silence. The button, cleaned and catalogued, lay beside him. Sergeant Mally had traced it to an old-style uniform, no longer in use except for ceremonial wear by the Flaxborough Municipal Band. Purbright examined the small crown etched on its face. "So," he murmured, "our ghost is patriotic?" Mally, standing awkwardly in the doorway, cleared his throat.
"Our bandmaster says they've all their uniforms accounted for, sir. No one's missing anything. Not even a button. Not even that."
Though he did mention one of the trumpeters, Mr. Hiskett, has been off sick for a week. Purbright looked up, expression unreadable. "Sick or rehearsing?" "Couldn't say, sir. He's an excitable sort."
"Likes his theatre." "Yes," Purbright said softly. "So do most people in Flaxborough."
"They just prefer the audience to be smaller." When Mally had gone, Purbright turned his chair toward the window and watched the street below. Respectability was the town's favourite costume, well pressed and carefully maintained. Yet beneath its polished fabric, he often sensed the quiet rustle of something more human: envy, vanity, longing, fear, all the threads that stitched ordinary life together. He thought of Mrs. Frowes, waking to the sound of her garden gate, of Miss Trousby, half hoping the mystery might raise her profile at the Women's Guild, of Councillor Glossop, puffed with gossip disguised as civic concern. The mask, he reflected, had done more than frighten, it had exposed. It had given the town a reflection of its own concealed desires. He rose, took his coat, and walked into the square. The air smelled of wet brick and faint soap from the laundrette. At the corner he met Reverend Chubb, who greeted him with the solemn cheer of a man hoping to be useful. "Terrible times, Inspector?"
"People are locking their doors."
"Even Mrs. Trousby's cat hasn't been seen since Tuesday." "I suspect the cat is simply avoiding conversation," Purbright replied. The vicar gave a thin smile. "Still, this business with the mask, it unsettles people. It makes them question what sort of place Flaxborough really is." Purbright paused. "That's just it, Reverend. Most towns look different when the lights are out." He moved on, turning into the high street, where shopkeepers were sweeping water from their thresholds. Their nods were courteous but curious, each wondering how near the inspector was to unmasking something, each pretending not to. Outside the tobacconist's, a small boy tugged at his sleeve. "Sir, me mum found this by the bus stop." From his pocket, he produced a crumpled scrap of paper. Purbright unfolded it carefully. It was part of a newspaper, the same type as before, but this piece carried a faint outline in pencil, an unfinished sketch of a face.
"A smiling one, thank you," Purbright said, slipping the fragment into his wallet.
"Tell your mother I'll see it's looked after." As he walked back toward the station, he thought again of the typed note. Every mask must be worn twice. There was an artistry to the phrase, a deliberate symmetry. Whoever was behind it wasn't simply hiding. They were composing. And like all compositions, it would eventually require an ending. He reached his office as the clock struck noon. The reflection of the rain-smeared window framed his face faintly against the street outside. For a moment, in that blurred pane, it seemed as though another face hovered behind his own, a pale oval, patient and amused. Purbright did not turn. He merely regarded it quietly, as though it were a thought he had already anticipated.
"Yes," he said under his breath, "you've made your entrance."
But even actors must take a bow. The reflected shape faded as a cloud passed over the sun. Purbright sat again, picked up the button, and set it neatly beside the newspaper fragment. Both small, both ordinary, both capable of making people see themselves differently. In Flaxborough, he reflected, respectability was not a virtue, but a performance, and somewhere, someone was taking curtain calls in the dark. By the following evening, the drizzle had lifted, leaving the pavement slick and shining beneath the street lamps. The town, though outwardly calm, was restless in its routines. Curtains twitched earlier, shop doors closed sooner, and the gossip at the Rose and Crown had turned cautious, as though the very act of speaking might summon something from the dark. Inspector Purbright, however, appeared untroubled. He dined alone at his desk, cold meat, a heel of bread, and a flask of tea, while his thoughts moved carefully over the small collection of evidence before him. The button, the newspaper scrap, the note with its theatrical flourish. Each item, so mundane in isolation, seemed now part of a composition whose melody he could almost hear, but not yet name. It was nearing 9 when Sergeant Malley returned, dripping from an errand. "Sir, I've been to see that band fellow Hiskett."
Not sick at all by the look of him.
"Said he'd been taking a bit of rest for the nerves." "Lives above the Drapers on Hill Lane." Purbright regarded him steadily.
"And his nerves, did they improve when you mentioned the mask?"
Malley hesitated. He laughed, sir. "Said the whole town's gone daft, seeing faces where there aren't any." "Did he now?" Purbright said quietly. "Strange thing to say, if one's been unwell." He rose, smoothing his jacket, and took his hat. "Let's take a stroll, Sergeant. I've a feeling Mr. Hiskett's rest may have been interrupted by rehearsal." The rooms above the Drapers smelled faintly of stale tobacco and brass polish. Hiskett, a tall man with thinning hair and an uncertain smile, answered their knock in a dressing gown.
"Inspector, is it?"
"Well, I can tell you straight off, I've done nothing theatrical since Christmas." "Then you'll forgive the intrusion," Purbright replied mildly. "We've had reports of certain appearances, and as a man of performance, I thought you might help us understand the technique." Hiskett's eyes narrowed.
"You think I'm behind that nonsense?"
"The mask in the papers? Good Lord, I've no time for childish stunts." Purbright gestured toward the mantelpiece, where a half-painted papier-mâché form lay beside a tin of glue. "And yet you found time for art," the musician flushed.
"That's just an old project."
"The band used to do pageants."
"Haven't touched it in months." Purbright stepped closer, his tone conversational.
"A pity, it's rather well done. Though this one, I notice, isn't smiling." Hiskett shifted, suddenly defensive. "You can't come in here implying—" "I'm not implying," Purbright interrupted softly. "Merely observing. But tell me, Why does a man who's unwell keep paint under his nails? The silence that followed was fragile. Mally, shifting his weight, caught the faintest tremor in Hiskett's hands. Then the musician laughed, a brittle, unconvincing sound. "All right, Inspector."
I made one mask, just one.
"For the Jubilee Parade, months ago, Mrs. Frowes asked me to, said she wanted something memorable for her garden tableau, but she never used it, so I threw it out." Purbright's face did not change, but something sharp flickered behind his calm eyes. "Mrs. Frowes, you say? Interesting. She told me she'd never seen such a thing before." "Well, she's mistaken," Hiskett said quickly. "Or pretending. Perhaps both," Purbright murmured. "And you, Mr. Hiskett, did you also throw away the rest of it?" "The second half?" "The what?" "The mask," Purbright said quietly. "You see, whoever's wearing it now has used 2 layers. Paper over plaster, one to conceal, one to hold."
Every mask must be worn twice, remember?
Hiskett paled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Purbright said, almost kindly. "And I think you're frightened of someone who knows it too." The man's gaze darted toward the window, then fell. "She came to me again, last week, wanted another. Said she'd been dreaming of her husband's face." Purbright's voice softened.
"And you made it?" I did. "But I swear I never went near her house."
"I believe you," Purbright said, adjusting his hat. "You're not the type to frighten widows, Mr. Hiskett. You're the type to please them." As they left the flat, Mally gave a low whistle. "You think she's behind it, sir?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. The street was quiet, the wet pavement reflecting their lamplight like a mirror turned sideways. Finally, he said, "Every performance needs an audience, Sergeant. But sometimes the one who applauds the loudest is also directing the play." They walked on, the sound of their steps mingling with the slow patter of rain beginning once more, a patient, rhythmic beat, as though the town itself were keeping time for whatever act was yet to come. By the time the morning fog began to clear, Flaxborough's gossip had already rewritten the events of the previous night into a dozen tidy morals. Some said Mrs. Frowes had fainted at the sight of her own reflection. Others whispered that Purbright had arrested a musician in full disguise, and that the mask had screamed when it was removed. The town was never more at ease than when misinformed. Purbright, however, was not at ease. He had spent the early hours reviewing statements, walking the length of Hill Crescent, and thinking, always thinking, but saying little. The evidence, slight as it was, formed not a chain but a pattern, deliberate, elegant, almost affectionate. Someone had wanted the town to look at itself and be unsettled by what it saw. He asked Sergeant Mally to invite both Mrs. Frowes and Mr. Hiskett to the station that afternoon. When they arrived, she brisk and composed in black, he nervous in an ill-fitting coat, the inspector greeted them with such gentleness that both mistook it for harmless courtesy. "Thank you for coming," he said.
"I thought it might be helpful if we spoke together, since your stories appear to share
themes." Mrs. Frowes gave a small, dismissive laugh.
"If this is about that silly business in my garden, Inspector, I assure you I've quite recovered."
"I've even decided to forgive whoever was responsible." "How generous of you," Purbright said. "Then perhaps you'll help me understand something. Mr. Hiskett tells me he made a mask for you at your request." Her composure wavered.
"A misunderstanding."
"I did ask for a decorative piece once, for a garden fete, but it was never finished." Hiskett, staring at his shoes, muttered, "It was finished." "You said you wanted it lifelike." Mrs. Frowes turned on him sharply. "That's absurd. Why would I want a mask that looked like anyone?" "Because," said Purbright quietly, "it wasn't meant to look like anyone. It was meant to look like your husband." The silence that followed was long enough for the clock to count 6 beats. Mrs. Frowes's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her eyes, once sharp with certainty, flickered with a strange mixture of fear and pride. "That's ridiculous," she said at last. "My husband has been dead 3 years." "Yes," Purbright said. And yet you've kept his clothes, his photographs, his shaving brush. You've spoken to him, perhaps even heard him answer, in dreams that don't feel like dreams. Her chin lifted. Are you suggesting madness, Inspector? No, he replied evenly. I'm suggesting loneliness.
And a kind of artistry.
You wanted to keep him alive, in spirit at least. So when Mr. Hiskett made the mask, you saw in it something more than paper. You saw memory. Hiskett glanced up, stricken. She said it was for a play, something private, in her garden.
I didn't know. Purbright raised a hand.
You didn't, but someone else did. Someone who found that discarded mask in your shed and decided to finish your little production. Mrs. Frows's voice was barely a whisper. Finish it? The masked figure that visited you, Mrs. Frows, Purbright said, leaning forward, was not haunting you. It was mocking you.
A man who knew your weakness and your secret. Her hand trembled on the armrest. Who? Purbright's tone was almost tender.
Your late husband's business partner, Mr. Pottle. The same man who discovered your husband's creative bookkeeping and covered for him to spare your reputation. He's been visiting the hall after hours, helping with parish work, so he said.
I suspect he kept the key.
He wanted to remind you what secrets cost. She stared at him, colour draining from her face. You can't prove that. I don't have to, Purbright said quietly. He proved it himself. The paper used for the first note, to be delivered after midnight, matches the notepads in his office. The ink, too. He left it there because he wanted me to find it. The widow sat very still, her breath uneven. Why would he frighten me? Because he's been paying your debts for 3 years, Purbright said gently, and you've refused every advance that might have justified the expense. Hiskett made a small,
strangled sound. Mrs. Frows turned toward him in shock,
as though she had forgotten his presence. Purbright rose, buttoning his coat. Mr. Pottle will not trouble you again. He left town early this morning by coach, not train. People who perform such dramas seldom wait for their reviews. He moved to the window, looking out across the square where the afternoon sun lay faintly on the cobblestones. Behind him, Mrs. Frows exhaled slowly, as if remembering to breathe. Inspector, she said, her voice brittle, I suppose you think I invited this? Purbright's reply came softly, almost kindly. No, Mrs. Frows, I think you built the stage. He merely borrowed the mask. When they had gone, the inspector stood for a long time beside the window, watching the reflection of his own face in the glass. It was, he thought, a curious thing, that guilt and innocence so often wore the same expression. Outside, the sky dimmed toward evening, and in the wavering reflection of the glass, his face seemed to smile. Not mockingly, not cruelly, just faintly amused, like someone who had, at last, seen the end of a play that everyone else mistook for real life. Morning returned to Flaxborough with an almost exaggerated calm, as though the town had agreed, by silent consensus, to forget that anything odd had ever disturbed it. The market stalls reopened, the church bell resumed its punctual chime, and the citizen published a politely evasive notice thanking the police for their discreet handling of recent misunderstandings. No mention was made of masks, widows, or moonlit gardens. Flaxborough had folded its drama away neatly, like an umbrella after rain. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, reading the brief telegram that confirmed Mr. Pottle's departure from the county. The coach company reported that he had purchased a single ticket for Bristol, paid in cash, and boarded with one small case. There was nothing illegal in leaving town. Of course, nothing at all. But Purbright suspected that somewhere in that case lay a carefully folded white mask, its paint faintly cracked along the smiling line. He placed the telegram in the file marked Closed Enquiries and reached for his pen. Paperwork was a kind of quiet afterthought, the necessary punctuation to other people's sentences. Yet, even as he wrote, he found himself pausing, uncertain whether the word closed was ever quite the right one in Flaxborough. Outside, the square was washed in pale sunshine. Miss Trounsby was already holding court near the bakery, recounting how she had personally warned the authorities about the entire business. Her audience nodded in the indulgent way of those who preferred stories to accuracy. Mrs. Frowes, meanwhile, had retreated to her garden. She had cut back the roses, burned the withered stems, and removed the sundial entirely. Yet, curiously, in its place she had planted a single white rose, a new variety, she said, called resurgens. Purbright, passing her gate on his afternoon walk, paused to admire it. She appeared at the doorway, veiled against the sunlight. "It's peaceful now," she said, as though making conversation with a neighbour rather than an investigator.
"Everything's
"Simpler. I'm glad to hear it," he replied. "Though I wonder if simplicity ever lasts long in Flaxborough." She smiled faintly.
perhaps not."
"But it's nice to pretend." He tipped his hat and walked on. Behind him, the faint sound of her shears snipped rhythmically through the quiet, like punctuation marks to thoughts unspoken. At the corner of the square, Sergeant Malley was waiting, leaning against the station wall. "Quiet week again, sir," he said cheerfully.
"Feels almost dull, doesn't it?" "Let's be grateful," Purbright murmured.
"Dullness is this town's idea of virtue," Malley grinned. "Funny thing, though, when I locked up last night there was a letter on your desk. No name. Thought it was old, but the paper looked new. Want me to fetch it?" Purbright nodded absently, and Malley returned a moment later with a plain envelope. The inspector turned it over in his hand. Inside was a single sheet of thick white paper, unmarked except for the faintest pressed imprint at the centre, a small, curved indentation, as though something had been lightly traced by a fingertip. He studied it for a long time before slipping it into the drawer with the others. The rain had long since stopped, but Flaxborough's air still carried the smell of damp roses and secrets best left to wilt. Later, as the lamps were lit and the square emptied, Purbright stood by his office window. The reflection of his own face gazed back at him, calm, polite, unreadable. Behind that familiar countenance, he fancied, hovered a second outline, pale and almost smiling. He did not flinch. Instead, he gave it the smallest nod, as if acknowledging an acquaintance met too often to ignore. Then he turned out the light, the faint glimmer in the glass fading with him, and returned to his desk, where the paper lay blank and waiting. Outside, the wind moved softly through the gardens, brushing the petals of the new white rose. It swayed gently in the darkness, luminous beneath the moon, its bloom half open as though beginning to smile.